I hope everybody had a good week and weekend. I noticed that several people did turn some things in, which is always good. Before we launch to today's lesson, there's a couple things that I wanted to reiterate about grading and assignments. One is when you turn something in and you don't get all the points you feel you've earned, look at the comments that I've made about the assignment. Sometimes it's as simple as not turning in the right assignment for the right assignment request. So for example, turning in weekly reflection 9 for weekly reflection 10, which usually is a pretty simple fix. Other times there are things like not having citations in alphabetical order. I've got a couple of projects that were just turned in that were excellent projects, but they were missing a whole point because a couple of citations were flipped alphabetically. Sometimes it's not realizing that you used a URL instead of an MLA format citation. And again, that can be usually pretty easily fixed. But there's been a couple of projects that I think people have had really fun ideas for projects. Remember, we said that almost anything goes, but I wasn't able to give them very many points because, or sometimes no points at all, because the person was not able to articulate how the project fit the coursework. Remember, you won't get any points at all for projects that have nothing to do with the class. Now, I mentioned before, and I wanted to give a couple examples. You can do a lot of different things for projects, and I'm giving you pretty much free rein on what you do for projects, but you must be able to, in the introduction, articulate how the project ties into the class and demonstrate that. And again, the class is 20th century art. Any of the things that we cover in any of the modules that we have. Why is that important? Well, I've had two projects that I think are really kind of interesting. One, it was an image of a tattoo, and another was an image of a sandwich, and done by two different people. It didn't make any sense what they had to do with the class. So talking to the two people, they realized that they had not written down anything that tied into the class, and they didn't write down what their process was, any of the sources that they used to kind of navigate or justify their process. When you're, for example, doing a project where you're making a new painting in the style of somebody else's painting, you have to have citations that demonstrate where you got your information as to what this or that style of painting looks like. And it ended up being that both of these people were able to resubmit their projects with the correct introduction and correct information, and they both got A's. The one with the tattoo, it wasn't a random tattoo. What this person had done, it was for a contemporary art class. This person had done a lot of research to find a really good website, an AI website, where they were able to put in some specific parameters and have the website generate an actual tattoo. And then he spent some time finding somebody who was willing to have the tattoo put on them. And then he articulated the process of actually tattooing with this AI generated image. And by tying all that together and sharing his references, that completed the project and he got an A. For the sandwich, the person was in my class, which dealt with prehistorical art up through the Gothic period. And what they had found interest in was the fact that olive oil jars were so prevalent in a lot of Greek and particularly Egyptian imagery. And so they did some research on Egyptian, in order to get credit for the project, they did some research on Egyptian tube painting and found evidence supporting olive oil jars in these tomb paintings. So it tied into the class that way. And then also found a lot of evidence for the ceramic work done for olive oil jars. and was able to share images of that. So they were able to talk about both painting imagery as well as ceramic work. And then they put in their, this introduction was actually several paragraphs long. They said, well, I know that olive oil was really important at this time, as can be evidenced in the art from that time. I wonder what other things it can be used for, and I wonder if we use it very much today. And it dawned on me that we make sandwiches with it. And so that person documented making a sandwich using an olive oil dressing, giving the recipe for the olive oil dressing and everything. That way, they were able to tie in their project specifically to the course material. Now, the course material for this class is going to be 20th century art. So whatever you do, you need to be able to tie it into 20th century art. So if you are doing a discovery project and you're making something, either make something in the style of one of the artists that are covered, in the style of one of the movements that are covered, or if you're going to be doing exploring more creative options, you could even make foods that you see in images of 20th century art. For example, the muffins in some of the regionalist paintings that we saw last week. There were a couple paintings that showed farm life, and there were two that I'm thinking of. One was where you see a wagon on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side was a mother, and she was cooking, and the wagon was taking somebody somewhere. Another one was a family rushing out of the house, going into a storm cellar in Kansas. And both of those, I believe, had imagery of food in them. And that would be a really good tie-in. You could explain where you saw the imagery of food, of whatever food items that you're making, and what paintings, how it ties into the class. And then say, so for my project, I decided to make a bread loaf to look like the bread loaf that is on the counter of this regionalist painting, or for example, something like that. So it can't just be something where I know that these people lived in the Midwest, and I have lived in the Midwest too, so something that I do is going to tie in with them. No, it needs to be specific, and it needs to be specifically tied into art of the 20th century within the scope of this class. If you have any questions or concerns, you have some great ideas. Several people have already emailed me asking how we can get their project to work. And if you do that, I'm happy to talk with you, or we'll email back and forth, whatever you want to do, so we can sort that out and make sure that it works for you. I hope you understand that. I hope that makes sense. Now, this class I created specifically as a precursor for my contemporary processes class. And so the art that we look at this kind of comes to a close right around 1980 or so. What I think I'm going to do is the last 3 sections of this class, or the last 3 modules, I'm going to revamp a bit so that we can get it more current to the year 2000, cover some more of the things that were done. Because during the 90s especially, you get a lot of really interesting stuff, like artwork from somebody named Corey Archangel and people like that. And we start getting into, he did a lot of digital work where he was doing some conceptual work and playing with ideas that revolve around the burgeoning use of computers and the internet. And then we also see the development of artwork in game design. So and that's just a couple things, but there's some other stuff too. There's some architecture and things that are really interesting as well. So I think so right now, don't get too far ahead. Keep in mind that I'm probably going to be changing those last 3 modules a bit so that it's more current. All right, now today, what we are going to be talking about is artwork. Let's see. Oh, there is one more thing I want to talk about before we go into the lesson completely. One is, if your project is really creative and you think I might not be able to understand it, like if you're doing dance or things like that, please email me or explain when you submit your project in the comments box, explain what it has to do with the class and why. Well, no, you're going to be doing that in the introduction. Explain how you came about this project, and if it's different than one of the formats that I require, ask me if it's or explain to me why you're doing what you're doing and how much time you spent on it, and get a conversation going so we can make sure that you get credit for your work. All right. So this week we are looking at Mexican muralism and abstract expressionism. One of the things we talked about last week was regionalism. And towards the end of the class, it talked about regionalism being something, what American regionalism was specifically an American art movement that happened during the Depression to help people regain an understanding and appreciation of their own identity. And that's American regionalism. But we talked a little bit about regionalism as an art movement. What is interesting to me about regionalism is that it can be absolutely anywhere in the world. The thing that is consistent about regionalism is that it expresses a group of people who identify themselves in a certain way and are creating art to help approach a better understanding, more thorough understanding, or a reconnection with that sense of identity. And sometimes it's with people that have lost their identity completely. Sometimes I get really excited about some countries that are emerging from colonialism, where people have found ways of adjusting into the contemporary world and have been able to find a way to heal the scarring that separated them from their own history during the process of colonialism or colonization. And a couple of the artists that I mentioned were Yinka Shonibare and Anatsui. Both of them do things that have many of the same hallmarks as we saw with the American regionalism. Yinka Shonibare he does not use recognizable human portraits all the time. That's not where his realism lies. What he does generally is use things like mannequins that are normal store mannequins, and then dresses them in very vibrant colors and clothing. Usually the cloth patterns are ones that very specifically come from Northern Africa, several of the countries there. Really beautiful stuff. And then he changes out elements of the mannequin so that the mannequin is much more approachable by a broader spectrum of people. So and what is exciting about that to me is that he's still bringing in the realism. You know, these are life size. They're dealing with things that we understand and recognize. And he's slightly twisting it a little bit. The mannequin doesn't read as a specific individual like it would a regular store mannequin, but he does it he abstracts it in such a way that everybody can see themselves in the mannequin by the gestures and things like that. Anatsui will create, and I want you to look at both of these names, Yinka Shonibare and Anatsui, and I will put, see, I'm going to make a note right now so that as soon as I'm done recording this, I'm going to put a link to some of their work in the attendance thing for you to look at, so you can check them out. But Anatsui, his realism comes, he makes these things out of garbage, basically, that become these gigantic tapestries that even though they're little sharp metal bits that could really hurt you if you pressed on them too closely, when you stand back at about 20 or 30 feet and get more of the 30,000 foot view, these become incredibly beautiful, large-scale tapestries. The tapestries themselves don't seem to have a specific imagery involved. They more are designed to evoke an emotional response of things like comforting and shelter. And so he does, the realism comes with in the fact that these are things that you can recognize. They look like hanging tapestries. And he uses garbage. He uses pop cans, beer cans, lids from milk bottles, and things like that. And the abstraction comes in that you're not entirely sure what it is that he's representing specifically, because it's not an object that you can identify or name, but it's broad enough that you can identify with the emotion that he's evoking. I think those both qualify in the realm of regionalism. And I would like you to look at those and see what you think. Okay, I'm going to write that down. As soon as we get off this call, I'm going to go and add a couple links for you to look at. And what I'll require you to do is look at either one, and they're only going to be short videos. Look at either one and pick one of them to make one of your comments about for one of the 5 attendance points. Now, we've looked at Europe and North America quite a bit for the time right around World War I and 1910 to about 1920, and then the aftermath too. And in that section from between 1910 and about 1930, what we've got is a lot of movements that include things like Dada and Cubism, abstract expressionism, the Bauhaus, Soviet. I completely forgot the Russian futurism. That's it, and then also American regionalism. What was happening here in the Americas in 1910 and 1920? The United States and Canada did not have an awful lot to do with it, but during that 10-year stretch was the Mexican Revolution. Now, Mexico in the 16th century, so we're talking about 1530 to about 1620, the Mexican artists, this is after the Spanish conquest of Mexico, Mexican artists up to about 1700, so a little bit later, this is during the Baroque era, they were wood carvers that were considered by people in Europe to be the very best in the world. And Mexican wood carvers were absolute masters of their craft, and they would do realistic portrayals of Catholic saints for consumption in the noble houses and wealthy homes in Europe. You weren't really a self-respecting European landowner unless you had something from a wood carving from Mexico. So these guys were top of the top, very best. They would paint the wood and ship these things over so that people could have an imagery of Saint Sebastian or Madonna or whomever they needed, and it would be photorealistic and absolutely gorgeous. And some of these wood carvers are just astounding. So I would recommend looking that up at some point if you'd like. Mexican Baroque wood carving. Really, some really amazing stuff. But during this time, from about 1350 until about 1910, Mexico had been under the rule of several different people. And a lot of people suffered because when new rulers would come in or take over, they would hurt everybody that seemed to support the previous regime, or they would take advantage of the people that were there, or there would be something else that it made it feel like there was always somebody that wasn't being treated fairly. I wasn't alive during the time, so I don't have much memory about that. But I can imagine it would be very difficult if you were peacefully working in your field and then the Aztecs come in, take over everything. And then shortly after that, the Spanish government comes in and takes over everything and starts killing everybody that doesn't agree with them or forcing them to get baptized or whatever. That this wasn't entirely the Spanish government. The conquistadors were sent by the Spanish government to find, part of their mandate was to find new converts to worship Christ. And by the time a conquistador got to Mexico, a lot of the nice things like respecting other people's ideas and stuff like that just didn't seem to matter to them as much as fulfilling their mandate. One of the reasons for this is that the Pope at the time was getting anxious for the Second Coming, and the Second Coming was supposed to happen in the year 1500. This is why in 1492 the Pope encouraged Ferdinand and Isabella to fund Columbus so they could go to India from a different route and hopefully find new people to convert and baptize for Christ. And I don't know if you know this or not, but there was a lot of slavery of the people in this part of the Americas at the time. And when Isabella of Spain found out about it, she was horrified because she said, if we are claiming this land as our own, then by default, these people are Spanish citizens and we will never enslave our own citizens. And then she was told, no, that's okay. They're not real Spanish citizens. They're not. And then even though they were baptized as Christian, they weren't considered as human or with the same level of human rights as Isabella's subjects were. And I am being a little bit cynical. The icing on top was the fact that they were going to get a lot of money. I'm laughing, but it's not because I find it humorous. It's because I don't know what else to do to express what I'm actually feeling. So that the people that were living here in the Americas were not treated really well by those people that conquered them, which is true of most places, almost all places where somebody else comes in to conquer. And Mexico had a particularly harsh time during the 1800s because there were strifes and wars going on with the Spanish government as well. And there were governors that they would send over. I don't know if you folks are familiar with Zorro, the story of Zorro. He was a legend, a hero that was popularized through the pulp magazines of the time, but he was like the first superhero of non-religious superhero of the Mexican people, because he would fight against the injustices that the Spanish government and other people would lay on them. And it wasn't just the Spanish government, but it would be different governmental regimes, different things like that. At this time in the early 1900s, there was a lot of stuff going on in Mexico that's pretty sad. And I'm going to go ahead and get to the part, the introduction of this. Let's see. Here we go. Of this week's work that we're going to be looking at. Now I'm going on quite a bit about Mexican muralism. Abstract expressionism, these two things don't seem to have an awful lot in common, but these are the two things that we're looking at the time. And Mexican muralism, we're going from about 1920s at the end of the Mexican Revolution to about 1950s or so. In abstract expressionism, we're doing 1950s through 1960s-ish, maybe, 1940s, 1950s. Again, there's all sorts of issues when you talk about art movements because it's really hard to say, on January 17th at 2:30 in the morning, this is the first painting done in this style. Now, what do these two things? I've given you just a little bit of history about Mexico and just a hard time that people had trying to find an identity. You have indigenous people that had been liberated from the Aztecs, and the price of that liberation for the Aztecs was enslavement by the conquistadors. You also had black slaves that were being used as well, where human beings are enslaved. You also have people coming from other countries, including Spain. The government was by Spain. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but at the end of the Mexican Revolution, the constitutionally established Mexican government realized the country was so fractured they had to do something to create a national identity. They had to educate people. They had to allow people the opportunity to engage with their own real history. And and that's what established Mexican regionalism. Now, in contrast, abstract expressionism, and I'll demonstrate why I think that this is, it was a meditative response reacting to the atomic bomb panic. And I doubt a lot of people alive today really remember this. I'm old enough to remember that this was still a pretty scary thing. During the Cold War, that didn't end until about 1989, this was at the time when, after World War II, everybody in the world knew that the US had nuclear weapons. And other major powers, particularly enemies of the US, also tried to make sure everybody knew that they had nuclear weapons. So Britain had an arsenal, most of the countries in Europe had arsenals, uh, uh, and then also Russia, or the Soviet Union at this time, had an arsenal. And starting with the early 50s, people would go to the cinema, you'd watch a little cartoon, then you watch the feature, Daniel Boone or whatever the movie was. But there was also little short films that are only a couple minutes long. And I think I found one to show you where kids are being taught, and these are kids getting, expecting to see a G-rated film, are getting taught what to do when there's a nuclear bomb. You cover your head and hide in a corner, basically. And this was terrifying. What is interesting to me is I grouped these two things together, Mexican muralism and then abstract expressionism, just because I thought it would be kind of an interesting thing to go from one to the other. But what's fascinating is that both of them are are movements that became a way for artists to demonstrate to people and share their own personal journeys about finding meaning where there didn't seem to be any, finding a place, finding a center. And Mexican muralism did that primarily with imagery that we can relate to in a naturalistic way, stories that we know, that we grow up with, things like that. And abstract expressionism tried to resolve some of these same emotional and psychological conflicts by going the exact opposite way, trying to create things that didn't have a lot of relation to the natural world, that didn't have identifiable stories. And it's fascinating to me that both of these are responses to a similar situation, process of trying to find a center in a completely transforming world that is chaotic and scary. And they go about it in very different ways. Remember, I said a while ago that it's interesting to me that wars always produce marching songs as well as love songs. I think that's very fascinating that you get the same kind of impetus and people respond to the two different things very differently. Oh. Now, I do have a 2-minute video that I want to share with you about the Mexican Revolution that I think does a little bit better job of talking about it than I did. We'll watch this short 2-minute video, and it's this one right here, in case that YouTube makes me truncate it out of the class video. And then it will come back to this page to talk about it a little bit more. So even though, oh, did you guys see that at all? Oh man, okay. I am so sorry. We're gonna watch that again because I did not share. I did not share it with you. I am so sorry. Let's watch it again, and I will try to edit that out. If not, you guys get to listen to it twice.
2 minutes knowledge.
The Mexican Revolution was a complex and multifaceted conflict that lasted from 1910 to 1920. It was a major political, social, and economic upheaval that resulted in the end of Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship, which had lasted for over 30 years, and the establishment of a constitutional republic. The revolution was sparked by a variety of factors, including widespread poverty, social inequality, and political corruption. The revolution was led by a number of key figures, including Francisco Madero, Emiliano Zapata, and Pancho Villa. Madero, a wealthy landowner and political reformer, called for the overthrow of Diaz and the establishment of a democratic government. Zapata, a leader of the peasantry in southern Mexico, advocated for land reform and the redistribution of land to the poor. Villa, a former bandit, led a powerful force of rural fighters in northern Mexico. The revolution was characterized by a series of battles and skirmishes between various factions, and it was marked by a high level of violence and instability. The fighting was particularly fierce in the northern and southern regions of the country, where Zapata and Villa had significant support. The revolution also saw a number of major battles, including the Battle of Ciudad Juarez, the Battle of Torreon, and the Battle of Zacatecas. The revolution was a major turning point in Mexican history, as it led to the end of the Porfiriato dictatorship, the establishment of a constitutional republic, and the implementation of significant political and social reforms. The revolution also had a significant impact on the economy, as it led to the nationalization of key industries and the establishment of state-owned enterprises. However, the revolution also had a number of negative consequences. It caused significant loss of life, destruction of property, and the social and economic reforms were not implemented in the way they were expected. The revolution also led to the rise of authoritarian leaders who suppressed political opposition and civil liberties.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So while World War I was going on in Europe, and Cubism and all that kind of stuff, here in Central America, Mexico was trying to create its own identity, free from slavery and colonialization by other powers. Now, at this time across Mexico, you can imagine, literacy was about 15%. Dark Ages Europe, it was closer to 20%, if you can believe that. And I'm saying I have Dark Ages in quote because I'm talking about the period between the Carolingian Renaissance and the beginning of the European or the Italian Renaissance during the Crusades. And classroom sizes were pretty awful. I know that several of you are also teachers, but I found a website that said that there was an average of over 500 students for every qualified teacher throughout rural Mexico, which, when you put that into perspective, then this number seems a lot higher than it should be. It's amazing that so many people actually could read when it looks like everything was stacked against them. And rural Mexico, of course, at this time was almost all of Mexico. And nobody knew after the close of the Mexican Revolution, people really, they were not super well educated. They did not have a good understanding of their own history. When we were talking about Porfirio and his dictatorship, if you want to be an absolute ruler, it does not behoove you to provide an atmosphere where people think that they can question and learn. And so it was in his interest not to educate people. And it was, and so a lot of people had no idea what their own history was. And the new constitutional government of Mexico realized that it was going to be really hard to succeed and thrive on the world stage without having some sense of a national identity. And this may not seem like a big thing, but if you think about it, like Canada has a real strong national identity. You can usually tell, even if they sound the same, a Canadian and United States person, and when they get together, it's even a joke among us as citizens of the United States that the Canadians are going to be more polite. That's part of their national identity. And Mexico at this time didn't have any of that. And so the Mexican government found several different painters, 3 primary ones, and several different artists, and asked them if they would help them creating an environment, a visual environment, so that Mexicans could learn about their own history and become proud of being Mexican. And I think that, let's see, there are 3 principal Mexican artists that kind of define this Mexican muralism movement that happened between 1920 and 1950. So I think that this is going to be a pretty good one video. It's about 7 minutes long, and I think it's totally worth watching.
In this video, we're going to talk about Mexican muralism. Mexico has had a great tradition of painting on murals, starting during the Olmec civilization on pre-Columbian times, and also after.
Now, this is actually true. If we look at sites where there are temples, a lot of the times throughout Mexico, the temples would have beautiful murals painted in them. And many times we don't see them anymore just because of weathering.
The Spanish conquest during colonial times. But in this video, we are going to focus on one specific movement, artistic and social movement, that took place during the 20th century. A little bit of historical background. Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. He was greatly criticized because of the great disparity between the rich and the poor, exploitation of workers, and the fact that he was always favoring European culture and seemed to be ashamed of his own culture and didn't value Mexican culture. And also there were some allegations of electoral corruption that allowed him to stay in office for a long time. This situation led to the Mexican Revolution between the years of 1910 and 1920. The main goal was to overthrow Porfirio Diaz, but also to implement social and economic changes. Our relevant time begins now, at the end of the Mexican Revolution. The first president after the revolution was Álvaro Obregón, and he put José Vasconcelos as the Secretary of Education. José Vasconcelos was an advocate of education through public art, and he commissioned the creation of paintings on government buildings. That is, he paid painters to paint on the walls of government buildings. Mexican muralism is both an artistic and a social movement, and it was commissioned by the government that resulted from the revolution. For that reason, Mexican muralism reflects the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. Why paint on walls and not on paintings, like in a regular museum? Muralism, paintings on murals, gives access to all social classes to culture and also serves the purpose to educate the people.
I think that this is a really important point that they're making, that painting on walls, and these ones are shown inside, but this Mexican muralism was also painting on walls that were outside. This is vital because everybody had access to it. And when you as soon as you put something into a museum, there is a sense that it is inaccessible to some part of the population, either to those that somehow aren't worthy of being in the museum, or those who can't afford to be in the museum. And and these are implications, and I think you still feel it today when you go to a museum that's really fancy schmancy. There is a certain feeling that most of us get just by the fact that we are in the museum. And the muralists would paint on public buildings, on exterior walls, everywhere that they possibly could. And this was so that everybody could see this imagery.
And also serves a purpose to educate the people. The main painters of this movement are Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. One of the most important themes of this movement was a reflection about Mexican identity. This was a time of crisis in the national identity of Mexico. So it was a time to ask, who are we as Mexicans, and what does it mean to be Mexican? And where do we find answers to this question of the national identity? Usually history is a good place to start. So what are the important and key history moments, events, and people in Mexican history? We might begin with pre-Columbian past, the life of indigenous peoples of the Americas until the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Also, Spanish conquest was a key moment in the making of the Mexican identity. Also, Mexican independence from both Spain and France, and Mexican Revolution. Here we can see an example of a painting depicting pre-Columbian life by Diego Rivera called Mercado de Tlatelolco. It's a market, and here we can see people that challenge the idea of indigenous people as savages. On the contrary, here we see civilization and we see peace. Here we have two different paintings that show a different view of pre-Columbian life. Diego Rivera, again showing civilization, peace, work, collaboration. On the other side, we see a painting by David Alfaro Siqueiros that shows an Aztec sacrifice. This doesn't mean that David Alfaro Siqueiros continue with the idea of Aztecs as savages. What happens is that David Alfaro Siqueiros was the most radical of the three muralists, and he always saw or showed the most raw image of everything that he depicted. He was the most critical. Here we see two images of the Spanish conquest, also seeing different perspectives. David Alfaro Siqueiros, again, showing the most raw moments, showing the Spaniards torturing Cuauhtemoc, the last Aztec emperor, while José Clemente Orozco is showing a different image. He's showing Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conqueror, and Malinche, who was an indigenous interpreter. Mexican independence, another important time in history. Here we see two paintings by José Clemente Orozco, one of Benito Juárez, who was the leader of the Mexican independence from France, and another one of Miguel Hidalgo, the leader of the Mexican independence from Spain. And finally, we see two paintings about the Mexican Revolution. One is called La Revolución Mexicana by Diego Rivera. Again, he's showing a non-controversial image in which we can see all the stakeholders of the Mexican Revolution, the main phrases and slogans of this revolution: Tierra, Libertad y Pan, land, liberty, and bread, and a painting by José Clemente Orozco in which he's showing another image of the revolution, one that is a little bit more nuanced with some pain and suffering of the people during this conflict.
I really like seeing that, looking at that. So that, again, this is that first video there in case it doesn't show up. And what is absolutely fascinating to me about this is looking at those, we can see there are some common links. And I think that if we make the argument that this is Mexican regionalism, I don't think that that's a silly argument to make. Looking at the imagery of these paintings, I think you can see a lot of the same stuff that's going on with the regionalism that we looked at last week. You have kind of this flat perspective. You don't have much of a logical sense of volume of space. And the people look like they are identifiable. There's a lot of stuff that we can recognize naturalistically, but things are just a little bit off. So it's just slightly non-realistic, slightly abstracted, slightly different. Like things like the lack of panic around the fire here, for example. Everybody standing like they were standing right on the edge of some sort of sidewalk or something. So everybody is the same size for the most part, or illogically big, so that we can see who they are and recognize who they are rather than be convinced that this is a realistic depiction of normal space. So I think that those two things, and the third one is there is a narrative, there is an identifiable story. And those three things are exactly like what we saw with the American regionalism. So we have a distortion of space, a pretty close approximation of recognizable depiction, and story or narrative going on. Now, in this particular scene, it says "Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Central Park" from Diego Rivera. He has people from spanning across several centuries of history that are all together in one spot. And what Diego Rivera did quite a bit was try to give people a sense of the fact that all these historical figures did relate to each other somehow. And he's not trying to give you a literal depiction of the passage of time, but he's trying to demonstrate that these people all had value and consequence to the history of the country. And what's interesting is that at this time period, while these artists were active working under the government to help educate Mexicans and help them develop their own identity, during this time, a lot of people started recognizing historical figures through the imagery that they saw in these murals. Now, Diego Rivera, I think, is the kindest of the muralists. I think his stuff is the most accessible to most people because you don't see a lot of things that are challenging. What you do see is a very specific and commanding confidence with the job he's tasked to do, which is basically document history, show it with respect, and help educate people. That's what Diego Rivera did. Now, Jose Clemente Orozco, what's interesting about him is he would do things that had a lot to do with the same kind of subject matter. They overlapped a lot, but his was a lot more challenging. His work tried to get you to think about what are the ramifications of these elements of history. And what's fascinating about this image is that it can be a little bit difficult to look at. But what Orozco was trying to do is demonstrate that science in the pursuit of progress or knowledge without any sort of guiding conscience is horrible. I mean, this looks like a scene out of hell. And he was really pushing people not to buy into the ideas that all progress is good progress, but that we need to be consistent with who we are as human beings and move forward with a very powerful awareness of how we grew from our past. And a lot of Orozco's work is like that, where he's asking us to examine these things and think about them and use them as guides to help us from making the same mistakes or similar mistakes in the future. And David Alfaro Siqueiros, what he did was stuff to show the nasty things of history cannot be overlooked and forgotten, because then we will repeat them. And what's interesting is that a lot of the times he will do stuff that feels very challenging, very confrontational, and even sometimes it feels ugly. And he's doing this specifically to get us to think about the things that happened. What is going on? You know, the human beings involved in history are human beings, and despicable things happen. When despicable things happen in our history, we have to be aware of that, make sure that we know why, and move forward so that we don't do it again. And some of his stuff can be very difficult to look at. It is definitely challenging. And all three of these artists were commissioned by the Mexican government, the same way that, what's his name? Stryker was commissioned by, was given the power by President Roosevelt to commission photographers for American regionalist photography. These artists were commissioned by Mexican government the same way. And I just happen to find that Diego Rivera's work is easier for me to digest and to come across than Orozco, his work, or Siqueiros. Now, there were other men and women that did this as well. One of my favorites of those is Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo was married to Diego Rivera. They were both very passionate people, very emotional people. And what is interesting is, for a long time, people thought that Frida Kahlo, they knew that she was a painter, but, you know, remembering this is way back 50, 60, 80 years ago, 1946, that is 80 years ago. Frida Kahlo was part of the generation of women in Mexico that were told to be quiet, do what your husband tells you, and look like a girl's supposed to. And she did not like that. She had been in an accident when she was growing up, and she did not get the best medical care that she could potentially have gotten. And she was in pain for the rest of her life. And even though she trained in the same style of painting that her husband, Diego Rivera, did, when she started realizing that she could potentially make a living and she didn't have to be his woman, you start seeing a shift in her artwork. And then they had a divorce, and she put together an art show and was able to get a gallery in France, get an invitation from a gallery in France to show it. And I have a newspaper clipping that I found where it says the wife of Diego Rivera showing her paintings instead of Frida Kahlo. And now hopefully everybody knows who Frida Kahlo is. But she stopped doing all the things that Mexican women were supposed to do. She stopped being the pretty girl, that they were supposed to do. Stopped shaving everywhere. Stopped plucking her eyebrows. Stopped doing all these other silly things that society demands that women do at the time. And she did a series of paintings that demonstrate that she is her own person. Now, the reason why I think that this fits in, even though she is doing things that are a lot more personal, is that she is addressing Mexican identity from the perspective of a woman living through it. And all these are addressing Mexican identity through narratives related to history. And so I do think that she fits in. It's that same kind of style. You have a distorted perspective. You have elements that are naturalistic enough that you can recognize what they were. And it's very evident there's a story there. But I think Frida Kahlo, even though these others, like this one, are rather surrealistic, Frida Kahlo, I think, was the most surreal out of all the Mexican, out of all the Mexican muralists. Now, we're going to move. I'm not doing a very subtle shift. There's no change, but there's no real link between these two movements, other than the fact that they both grew out of war. Mexican muralism grew directly out of the Mexican War for Independence and the Mexican Revolution. And abstract expressionism came out directly from World War II. And World War II managed to do a couple things which would not have happened otherwise. Helped the US and much of the world get out of the Depression, the Great Depression. The war, there were so many people that were shot at and killed, either as bystanders or active participants in the warfare, that there is an incredible advancement of medical technology and transportation technology, a lot of other things too. This is actually World War II. We can make the argument that it was provided direct impetus for the 20-year development that led to the internet, which I think is really fascinating. I don't know if you knew that there was an internet that was active from about the late 60s on in military installations. They needed a way of securely connecting and communicating via electronics, and that's how the internet was actually developed. And it wasn't until people realized that they could privatize it into the 80s that it became something that actually grew into what we recognize today. But World War II also gave us the atomic age, the atom bomb. And you can look at some of these different things. When we look at Aaron Douglas, he's one of the Harlem Renaissance superheroes, where there is this very strong stylization. There's an abstraction, the stylization, and we can recognize some of the things that are prevalent with regionalism in the Americas as well. Mexican and American, United States regionalism. And what's fascinating to me is, as this is going on, like we talked about, if there's a war, if you're going to have both marching songs and love songs. Different people will react to the same things very differently. I really love Aaron Douglas's work. There's a majesty to it that I think is just profound. But the Axis engine was so powerful. We're talking about Italy, Germany, and Japan. They were so powerful that they brought previous enemies together to work together. And after the defeat of the Axis powers, the Soviet and Chinese governments really continued with the communist style of governance and became enemies, or at least political enemies, with the what is now referred to as the West. Most of Western Europe, Britain, Canada, North America, Canada is in North America, the rest of North America, Australia, those kind of places. And let's see. I'm going to see how long this, I want to see how long this particular video is, because I think we may watch it. Let's see. Okay, it's only a minute and a half, so I think that'll be good. We're going to watch a video that talks about the Cold War. We're going to see how long this atomic age one is. It's about 2 minutes. I think that's a good one to watch as well. And then I really need to show you this duck and cover. But these things will hopefully help you to understand what was going on in the United States that led into abstract expressionism. So we're going to watch this video first. And again, if these don't show up in our YouTube recording of the discussion, please go ahead and watch them in the module.
After World War II, humanity went from a global military confrontation to another type of war called a Cold War instead of transitioning to a peacetime economy. Specifically, to a conflict which didn't involve direct military confrontations between the main participants, but rather an extensive arms race, continuous tensions, and occasional proxy wars. Ideologically speaking, it was a battle between Marxism and capitalism. Lasting until the dissolution of the USSR on the 26th of December 1991, the Cold War was long and extremely expensive. Over the entire Cold War period, U.S. military purchases amounted to roughly 17 trillion of today's dollars, and while reliable figures for the USSR are hard to come by, they've most likely spent less in nominal terms, but more as a percentage of their gross national product. In the end, the USSR collapsed under its own weight, as their over-centralized planning just didn't work. Collective farming was such a failure that the once powerful food exporter became a significant food importer. Industrial production and innovation suffered due to rigidity, and Russia went from being the first nation to send a satellite to space in 1957 to being surpassed by Japan and Germany, who had lost World War II. At a tie point in 1969, the USSR represented 14.31% of the world's economy, but by the year of its dissolution, it had collapsed all the way down to 3.58%. Comparatively, the US represented 28.69% of the world's economy at its highest point and never fell under 20%. The end of the Cold War ultimately proved that military might alone is just not enough. After World War II,
Okay, let's go. So that's a really brief discussion of what the Cold War was, but it was essentially people that were political enemies doing things, navigating around each other, playing for different percentages of clout on the world stage, and trying to get leverage over each other without allowing themselves to be drawn into open hostile conflict. This is one of the things that happened with both Korea and Vietnam, as the United States was involved in those wars, in part because they were resisting the Western or democratic governments were resisting the expansion policies of the communist governments like Soviet Union and China. And so, yeah, those are direct conflicts, but they were not direct conflicts with the people that were actually the enemies of the countries that were involved. So now I want to talk about the atomic age. If you remember, one of the reasons why World War II ended was because of the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on cities in Japan. And very quickly, governments that could afford to do so realized that these ultimate weapons, they were terrible enough that nobody really wanted to use them, but they were powerful enough that if you had them, people could would have to take you seriously, because there is a chance that you would use them. And any government that is interested in any way about the safety of their constituency has to address potential threats as well as real threats. And a potential threat in this case would be the possession that people have of atomic weaponry. So let's watch this really quick.
I want to be happy. I want to be gay. I want to be normal in every way. But a mushroom cloud hangs over my dreams. It haunts my future and threatens my schemes. Please, 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 where did you go? I've got me a sweetheart, and I love her too. We want to make big plans, but what can we do when a mushroom cloud has changed every rule? It's keeping our thinking at home and at school. Please, 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 where did you go? We pray, we party, we laugh, and we pray again. And we play it cool and try not to think of the mess we're in. I cling to my baby, and she clings to me. We talk of the future, but what do we see? There's a mushroom cloud that hangs in the way. Tomorrow looks black, so we live for the day. Please, 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 where did you go? Oh, please, 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 where did you go?
The nuclear weapons were considered a big enough threat by the different governments that we can find footage of all sorts of training exercises where, just like what we saw in that was taken from several different training exercise footage examples of U.S. servicemen, where people would be in these trenches and then have to approach immediately after an atomic detonation, with the idea being that even though very quickly got to the point of governments holding each other at stalemate because of mutually assured destruction, they wanted to be able to demonstrate to the enemy countries that if anybody did survive, then they'd be able to take over whatever was left, which that seems kind of silly to me, but in a very dark way. The men involved, nothing was silly about what they were doing. It was terrifying for them, and which is something that's very important to remember. The people involved were terrified. So I want to share this. This is the kind of thing that I was talking about, where little kids would be watching this during their movie times. You know, you'd go to a movie, you'd watch a Mickey Mouse cartoon, and then before you see Old Yellow or Where the Red Fern Grows, you would watch this.
And cover. Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. Then, you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do.
You.
And you. And you. And you.
Duck and cover.
Now I want you to think for just a minute, how terrifying would that be if you are just a kid hearing this all the time? And what's interesting to me is this is how we move into abstractionism, abstract expressionism, excuse me. These are not just ways for people to explore new ways of making art. It is very much about creating art that helps people to kind of find or establish some sort of presence of mind where they're surrounded by post-war economy, a lot of stresses, and this terrifying prospect of sudden obliteration with the atomic war, bombs. And there are several different kinds of abstract expressionists. They would do, like this one feels quite a bit more surrealist. This one almost seems like a mess. But one thing that is really interesting to consider, start looking at these as meditations. Mark Rothko would create these beautiful things. These are really large canvases that you could actually sit in front of for an hour or two. And it would be more like a Zen meditation. And then Jackson Pollock would create things where you could pick a color and start following the drips around, and then pick another color and do that. And after a while, your attention is so taken in by what's going on that you've disassociated yourself from your regular worries. What is fascinating, this is a very similar method that is used for distracting. I'm not going to say distracting. That is not the right word at all. For allowing people that participate in church services, for example, in a mosque, for example. The interior of a lot of mosques have a lot of decoration and design inside. And that is specifically so that people's, like a Jackson Pollock painting, people will, their eyes will start exploring the different patterns that they see. And after a while, they'll be separated from the normal problems that they had outside of the mosque. Or it could also be like, I don't know if you've ever been to a Benedictine cathedral, where it's basically white and shades of gray and a very simple background. There's nothing that's really super flashy or attention grabbing, but it allows you a moment to sit and reflect and calm, just like a Mark Rothko painting. And it does, and is there for very similar reasons. And then you get Franz Klein and Clifford Still, who did things that were intended to, again, take your attention and make you start considering and thinking and following these things that didn't give you a narrative to consider, didn't give you a story to follow, and there's no recognizable features necessarily, but it's there specifically to give you something to wander about mentally and look at without the burdens of vocabulary and articulation. I think it's a very interesting style of artwork. And there were photographers as well who did these kinds of things. And I think it's really astonishing. But one thing that I wanted to do is watch this short video about Steve Martin. And he was invited to the MoMA to talk about his take on abstract art, how he looks at it. And this is from the same kind of period that we're talking about. Abstract expressionism very much is abstract art. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's designed to get you involved and interested so you move outside of your normal everyday concerns, which makes a lot of sense when that normal everyday concern has to do with Cold War and the threat of atomic bombs. So let's watch this.
Low on the right. Exactly the same as it was. Perfect, I think.
To start, could you introduce yourselves to a British audience?
Okay. I think it would be a way to introduce myself to. Hi, it's Steve Martin.
All the guests were asked to choose one work of art from the collection. You've chosen two.
Yes, one painting is by Stanton McDonald Wright. They're both American paintings. And this was done in 1917, and the one over here is done by Morgan Russell, done in 1922. Essentially minor things compared to everything else that hangs at MoMA. I thought, gee, those are so, they're like lonely. And so I picked them. And these two artists, I believe, were both in Paris at the time, and they started working on this completely abstract system of painting. They called it synchromism.
Yes.
Which is with color. It means.
Yeah.
And they had come up with a fancy name for it.
Right.
As we all should. I don't generally care about theories. They kind of get in the way of looking at the picture. But I think the result of working from a theory can be fantastic. But it also could be done maybe without the theory. But you don't need to know the theory in order to appreciate the painting. I really like to look at it. And I can look at it a long time because there's a lot of different parts that succeed as a whole. I think of this as an intellectual painting, like a Leger.
It's the construction of the picture that he's interested in and that you're interested in, right?
I don't know, but I think so. Sounds good.
Sounds good. When I look at this picture, there's a real sense of,
you want to sing?
Luckily not, but lots of motion, lots of rhythm.
And there's a lot of depth. I mean, the image goes way deep. It's almost like in the top there, it feels a little bit like sky. I don't think he intended that. I hate to say this, but now I'm starting to see a landscape with mountains, sky, and water. I believe pictures reveal themselves over time. You can't really get it in one lengthy look. You know, it's great to be able to live with the painting or visit a painting in a museum and go back and back and back. And the good ones really do keep on giving. It's amazing. a picture is stationary, it's immobile, and yet it changes for you. But I just got to step back on this because my foot's asleep. I just am now convinced this is a landscape painting. This is a stream. These are jutting rocks. This is a mountaintop. That's the sky. That's sort of cloudy.
Has it improved?
Absolutely, for me. But now I see almost like a narrative story. I mean, even the Morgan Russell is. It's very voluminous. It's a floating object in a way.
But I think if you came back on another day, you'd see something different too.
Yeah, maybe.
Right? That's.
No, I'm convinced. This is a landscape, and nothing will ever change my mind. I always assumed this picture was one thing, and then sat here for an hour and looked at it, and it changed.
Now, what I like about this is, now those come from before the movement that we're looking at today. But what is fascinating about that process is he just allowed himself to explore the image without necessarily putting labels on it. And I liked what he said, that a really good painting will keep giving. And I think that that's absolutely true. And then we also have, let's see, I'm going to, I want to look at something else as well, really quick, if it's not too long. Now, this is abstract expressionism, and I think that this is totally worth watching. I like what this guy does, but this kind of gives you an idea from an art historical perspective. It's not necessarily my perspective. It's an art historical perspective about what abstract expressionism is. I didn't really define what it was. I just kind of talked about what it did in terms of allowing viewers and participants to step away from what at that time was the extreme stress of living in the United States, the post-World War II traumas of the threat of atomic annihilation and the Cold War.
So we're going to be dealing with abstract expressionism, and this is a very difficult movement to deal with because there's a lot of ideas, sort of intellectual concepts behind it. It's not as easy as, well, throwing paint at a canvas. So in terms of definition, abstract expressionism was never really an ideal label for the movement, which of course grows out of New York in the 1940s and 50s. Why? Because Europe is in pieces. Europe has been decimated by World War II. You don't have a lot of artists coming out of Europe at this time because most of them are trying to survive. Now, post-war Europe, we saw some, but they were generally from England or otherwise sheltered from the war for various reasons. Now, it was somehow meant, abstract expressionism was meant to encompass not only the work of painters who filled their canvas with fields of color and abstract forms, but also those who attacked their canvases with gestural abstraction, the idea of sort of throwing your paint at the canvas, recording your movement. We'll get into that in a minute. Yet abstract expressionism has become the most accepted term for a group of artists who did hold quite a bit in common. All were committed to the expressive art of profound emotion and universal themes. And most were shaped by the legacy of surrealism, a movement that they translated into a new style, fitted to a post-war mood of anxiety and trauma. That sort of existential issue that we dealt with in post-war Europe is again popping up in America in the abstract expressionist movement. In their success, the New York painters robbed Paris of its mantle as a leader of modern art and set the stage for America's post-war dominance of the international art world. So we also see artists who will focus on the properties exclusive to their medium. For example, paint. What is paint? What does it do? Well, it flows and it dries and it records its position as it dries. You can have a sense of three-dimensionality or two-dimensionality from paint. I'm talking about typography. I'm talking about impasto, sort of the idea of creating texture with paint. Their pieces will be abstract, and abstract in an attempt to express the artist's state of mind. Many of their works will be meant to be viewed by an outsider, not interpreted by an art historian, basically understood in any or no context. And there are two kinds of abstract expressionism, which I touched on briefly a moment ago. The first is gestural abstraction. This is Jackson Pollock. These are the paintings where at first it looks like you're throwing paint at a canvas. Now, the term gestural painting, also known as gesturalism, is used to describe a method of fine art painting characterized by energetic, expressive brushstrokes, deliberately emphasizing the sweep of the painter's arm or movement of the hand. It's really, you can imagine it as capturing movement, capturing dance as much as anything else. In other words, the brushwork in these paintings expresses the artist's emotions and personality, just like a person's gestures reflect their feelings in everyday life. Now, they also emphasize the physical act of painting itself, drawing attention to the process of creating, because, of course, when you look at it, you can see those sweeps of the arms. You can't get away from that creation process. On the other side, and this will be the next section that we deal with, the next chapter, is chromatic abstraction or color field painting. And this is the opposite end of the pole. Here we're looking at artists such as Mark Rothko or Clifford Still. And this is a type of painting based on more pure and absolute attitudes of consciousness. Originally derived from symbolist modes, their art admits accident and unpremeditated effects only at the margins and seeks instead to create this style that stands above chance, something that is outside of time, something that is starkly simplified and stable. And through simplification, they're hoping to reach the universal. The idea being, if I can strip out everything cultural, everything that speaks to a specific type of person, then I can speak to every person. Well, hopefully anyway.
When I started doing this simple ear trick.
What is interesting about that, I don't know if you remember who else were kind of trying to speak to every person. The Bauhaus was trying to do that by simplifying things an incredible amount. I think that's fascinating. The Bauhaus was a good 20 years to 30 years before what we see here. Wassily Kandinsky, I want you to watch this video that talks about his work and watch this, but he fits into this abstract expressionist thing. And it's interesting that he has a lot more to do with Lee Krasner, who was a lot more controlled with the objects that she painted than Jackson Pollock, who did a lot of splatter work. But I have men and women here. I want you to look at the video, and I want you to look at some of the imagery of their paintings. And let's see, this shows several paintings by Lee Krasner. Oh, I'm sorry, there's lots of extra stuff to look at. And what's fascinating about Lee Krasner is that she did a lot of things that make me think of graphic art, typography, where it looks like there's almost letters in her work, which I think is really fascinating. And then this is, of course, her husband, Jackson Pollock, who did, and these are how big these paintings are. They're gigantic paintings. They're huge. And then Helen Frankenthaler, here's a video. I want you to watch that in Franz Klein. Both of them did some absolutely amazing work. I'm going to look really briefly, show you what Helen Frankenthaler did. So you can see that. And I'm not going to show you the videos of these artists. I want you to watch those videos on your own, but just get a sense of what's going on. And Helen Frankenthaler, this is her foundation that shows her work. And what's interesting to me, Helen Frankenthaler does some of these same kind of things, makes some of these same kind of shapes that we see with Lee Krasner. And you get these broad areas of color that remind me a bit of Mark Rothko. But then you get stuff like this, which makes me think quite a bit of Pete Mondrian, Remember those early paintings that he did of trees? And then here, this makes me think of the Fauvist and Cubism a little bit. So Helen Frankenthaler did a lot of stuff that let you be aware that she was very knowledgeable about art and art history. Did a lot of absolutely beautiful things. And this kind of work fits, to me, a lot closer into what people were doing as the other abstract expressionists. This feels to me more like the same kind of thing, dealing with almost meditative reflections and ways to address trauma and stress. I think it's really fascinating. Then Franz Klein is another one of these artists that I have you look at. And then you see the artworks that he did. Some of these, yeah, you get landscapes and things like that. That was an early one. But as we hit into the 50s and around the Korean War, he starts doing these things that almost seems like graphical images, where they almost seems like he's working with calligraphy ideas coupled with the lines that a cubist might do when they're doing or creating a urban landscape or painting a house. And it's fascinating to me. And sometimes he'll do these things like this that make me think of, again, the color field paintings like what Mark Rothko did. And a lot of these were big paintings, really interesting stuff, where he's not trying to, unlike regionalism, he's not trying to give you a narrative or a story. It seems to me that he's more like figuring out what the paint can do, like what we heard about gesturalism. And the way to look at these, remember what Steve Martin talked about, it just allow it to kind of sit with you for a while. See if you do find things that you recognize. You know, maybe this looks kind of like the map of fencing in a horse paddock. I don't know. Maybe this looks kind of like a dog, but then be aware that Franz Klein is trying not to show you something representational. He's just trying to show you his interest in applying paint and making shapes. And I think it's really fascinating. So it is important that you look at these videos right here. Really help in finding meaning in abstraction, understanding the styles of art. I'm clicking on one. I'm trying to see how long it is. Okay, I think that this is a really good one. This will be the last thing I look at. I started a little bit late, and so I want to show you this video really quick. This is from the series that Smart History series. And this is three different people talking about how to look at abstraction. And this is that same kind of style of painting that for a lot of people is very difficult to look at.
We're in the galleries of the Art Institute of Chicago, and we're looking at a large painting. It's brilliantly colored, and it's abstract. We wanted to spend a little time just looking.
And we want to think about ways in which those of us who maybe don't.
Now, I want you to be aware of the painting that they're looking at is from 1955, and it does fit in that abstract expressionism movement. Okay.
Don't encounter abstraction on a regular basis can find entry points.
Abstraction can seem difficult. It's easy to dismiss quickly, and it really does take a little bit of our commitment to make sense of it.
One of the things about abstraction is that you benefit from taking more time. So I'd like to have us just start by glancing across the canvas and finding a color that stands out to you and trace not only the color, but the way the color is applied.
I'm looking at this beautiful bright blue. You see traces of it in the top third of the canvas, but then you see more in the central area, and none of those lines are straight. They seem like signatures. They turn and reverse on themselves. And while some of that blue exists on the surface, some of it seems underneath. And all of a sudden, I'm aware of a kind of space. Suddenly, this canvas doesn't feel flat to me.
There are places where I feel like couldn't even begin to get in between the brushstrokes. They're so ensnarled with one another. And then there are places which seem to open up as if they expand back into space.
The denser central passages feel activated to me. The word I would use is energy. There seems to be a colliding of color and stroke and tone.
I'm really drawn to the pink, which is largely underneath those blues that you noticed.
There's a section of the pink that almost seems to reveal the linen. And then I start to look for that same feature elsewhere, and I see it in other spots as well with aqua or blue or yellow.
And some areas seem very intentional, where we can feel the movement of the artist's hand. And then other areas feel rather accidental, where the paint is dripping down.
And so all of a sudden, this painting feels archaeological, as if we're able to reveal earlier moments in its creative process.
Let's think about this title, City Landscape. When you look at the painting, do you start to conjure up a memory of a city landscape?
The title is tricky for me because it closes down the openness of the meaning of the painting. It's a little bit like when you read a book. You have your own ideas about what a character looks like, but then you go see the movie and a director has made that decision for you. In an interesting way, you lose something.
But I want to challenge the idea that it can't also invite us in to bring our own personal interpretations and let just the prompt of city landscape open up a new avenue for exploration of this painting.
There's such a variety in the application of paint. All of those differences make me think about the bombardment of all the different kinds of things that one experiences in a city.
It's a kind of cacophony.
There are different questions that this painting poses for us. One of them is, how do we engage with abstraction? How do we understand it in the larger context of abstract expressionism?
Joan Mitchell, although she comes from Chicago, goes to New York, eventually to Paris, and has lived through the Second World War and is spending time with abstract expressionists. She is throwing off the yoke of representation that had ruled painting for centuries. And there was a tremendous assertion of freedom, of exploration that existed at this historical moment.
For me, it's enormously pleasurable to stand and just look at the paint and to imagine the brushstrokes and to indulge in the oranges and the yellows and the blues and the pinks and the magentas and all the different kinds of grays and creams that we see. But it's also just as interesting to think about why abstraction emerged in the United States after World War II. What did it mean at that moment? And those are questions that are really interesting to consider.
And I think it can be useful when you look at abstract painting to think about music without words. In a sense, what an abstract painting is asking us to do is to be satisfied with composition, color, brushwork, tonalities, the way that we're satisfied with notes and rhythms and harmonies in music. Music doesn't always need words, and painting doesn't always need to represent something. It can simply sometimes just be itself.
So coming back to this, that video was right here, Finding Meaning in Abstraction. And I really want you to watch all these as much as possible. Abstraction can be very difficult. And I kind of like having Mexican muralism and abstract expressionism next to each other, because on the surface, even though they don't seem to have an awful lot to do with each other, I think they both deal with issues where people are trying to find their center. And one, it's finding out who they are as individuals, as Mexicans, for example. And the other, trying to find a way to relate to a world that has just gone crazy. So I hope you guys enjoy that and got something out of this week. Like I said, I think I'm going to update the last couple modules so that they reflect more of a panorama of the remainder of the 20th century. There's just so much going on right now, up until about 1970, that we are still responding to. Like advertising, the websites that you visit every day are based on the Bauhaus geometry. The imagery in movie posters are based on things done by artists during the Harlem Renaissance, for example. Still, and really good journalistic photography is based on American regionalism photography that was done during the Depression. It's interesting to me that so many things relate directly to that stuff that we've looked at. So if you have any questions about assignments or anything like that, please let me know so I can answer them in next week's meeting. In the meantime, if you didn't get all the points that you wanted, or something that you turned in, look at my notes and see what you can do about it. And if you have any questions, contact me and we will talk about it. If you need any ideas for projects and stuff like that, talk to me. We should have 5 projects done now, and then you'll have one more project and then your final project. And several people have already been talking to me about what they want to do with their final project, and it's really exciting to see what you guys are coming up with. I would heartily recommend that if you have fallen behind in turning in assignments and things like that, look at what you can do and start doing it right away so you can get caught up. The easiest way to do this is first go through the attendance videos and watch those as quickly as you can. Second, do the weekly reflections as you go through the modules. And then third, work on your projects as well and get those done as much as you can. Several people have adopted a really interesting way of doing that, where they will do a project, ask me to look at it and grade it the way it is, and then tell them what I need to change so that it fits better into the class and gets a perfect score. And so I'll tell them what changes to make, and then they turn around, fix it, and turn it back in. And there's a couple people that do that really well. And I hope you know who you are because I've sent you comments. Very grateful that that's what you did. All right, guys, you have an absolutely wonderful week and weekend. I look forward to visiting with you next week. We'll see you.